Hi there, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me. It's tropical houseplants. So have you heard of a lot of hacks and things you can do that will really improve your houseplants, but you've tried some of these hacks and you've realized that they're not doing very much? Stick around with me in this video and let's talk about some myths rather than hacks when it comes to houseplant care. So I think most of us growing up as well, there's a lot of tricks that we've heard from different people when it comes to having houseplants and getting them to be happy. And the expression kind of old wives' tale does come a bit into play with this. Do not get me wrong, I am not bashing all of those tips and comments because some of them do work quite nicely as well. And there's a lot of people that get some grief for some of them as well. I can think of a very dear friend who had a plant shop and they'd learnt for years that if they wanted to shine the leaves, they used mayonnaise. It sounded out of this world for me, but actually I've spoken to a lot of people since then when I've been kind of telling the story that some of the, they mentioned this as a bit of a tip for people to grow their plants in their own environment, and they got their head bit off essentially. But I've talked to a lot of people since then, and there's versions of that story that have been floating around in loads of different families in loads of different countries all over the world. So the question then becomes as well, if people have had success with this, however odd it might sound, and it's probably because the mayonnaise, if I'm not mistaken, has got oil in it, and that is probably what's coating the leaves and it's kind of making it look a bit shiny. Would I put mayonnaise on top of my plant leaves? Probably not. That's a personal choice for that one. But yes, it's not all of these hacks or kind of growing tips that have been around for a while and kind of like do-it-yourself kind of tricks with plants are always going to be wrong. But I have selected a few that have been disproven time and time again, essentially, and it's good to put some of these to rest. I will say, however, if you've had some good experiences with any of these, and you do, and I mean personal experience, and you can talk after months of doing some of these things and you know you've had results and all these things, please do drop it down below, because a lot of these things could be considered hearsay, but maybe they're not. Maybe there's some validity to it. But based on what my research and what I've seen, a lot of these things, essentially this is going to be a bit of a myth debunk video, and I'll try to give reasoning behind every single debunk. So the myths that I'm going to go through today, and I've got my trusty iPad next to me just so I can kind of go through the list, is spraying plants to raise humidity, or misting plants to raise the humidity around them. And I know some of the OGs here and some people that have been growing for a while, they're probably already rolling their eyes to this one, but we'll dive into it in a bit more detail. And then the concept of plants thriving in low light conditions. The other is to let any houseplant that you have go completely, fully bone dry before watering it. That things like prayer plants, Calathea, Stromanthus, Tenanthes need to also be kept constantly moist and evenly moist all of the time in order to keep them happy. And I'll finish off with a bit of a bang with this one, that all houseplants need as high humidity as you can possibly give them. So onto the first topic of misting your houseplants to raise the humidity around them. So kind of the usual thing that you would do with a mister. And a lot of people love doing this. And this is actually something that my mother, when I was growing up, swore by, or at least she thought she swore by. She used to be like sitting there going and spraying her plants and misting her plants to kind of try and raise the humidity. I don't even think that she thought in terms of the humidity. She just thought, oh, they just like it. So yeah, it's an interesting one with that one, generally speaking. My mother's also the kind of person that used to love talking to her plants. And I know a lot of people love doing that as well. And I think that's a sweet kind of myth or trick, and that plants respond well potentially to being spoken to on the slightly more scientific. And again, this is very loose science here with something like speaking to your plants. It might just be because when you're speaking, you're exhaling, and you're exhaling carbon dioxide a lot of the times. And carbon dioxide is something that the plants need in order for them to grow. Granted, it's the same thing with misting your plants. Is there really enough of it around the plant for long enough to make a bit of a difference? Probably not, but I like the speaking to the plants a bit more than I do the misting to the plants. So this is a topic that a lot of people have already covered, so I might be going over some kind of well-trodden ground with this one. But generally, misting your plant isn't going to do very much in terms of raising the humidity. It will probably raise the humidity, the immediate humidity around that plant, maybe a minute or two. Water droplets, and especially the spray, the fine mist spray that you'll get from something like a spraying can, they're so small that the rate that these water droplets would evaporate and the level of humidity that they're going to create doesn't last very long, and it's not very high. So there is a notion of maybe save your wrist from the spraying action all the time, and maybe don't do that. Consider something if you're really worried about humidity, and I know this is really expensive, but consider something like a humidifier. Pebble trays have worked well for me when I was first starting out. So a dish underneath the plant with some pebbles and a layer of water. Just make sure that the plant pot and the roots of the plant aren't sitting in that water, but it does release a bit of humidity. Grouping your plants together creates a bit of a microclimate, so they all essentially will have water evaporating from the soil or the growing media around them, so it does create a bit of a micro bubble of some humidity there. So that is another thing. Putting plants in things like bathrooms or kitchens, because they generally tend to have more water vapor going in because of showers and because of cooking. Granted, both of those can be a bit challenging, so bathrooms can be a bit too cold at times, kitchens can be a bit too hot at times, so there are kind of plus and minuses with that. But when it comes to misting, just save your effort and maybe try something like a pebble tray, like a humidifier, like grouping your plants together or putting them in a different location to help raise that humidity. Just because I also know, like, most people that are still misting their few plants that they've had, they've only got a mister, and that thing it really does tire out your wrist quite a bit. So save yourself the effort. It's probably not making as much of a difference as you think it is, and try something new. The next topic is something that a lot of people are becoming a bit more aware of, and this is usually a bit of a trap that you fall into when you're first getting into houseplants and you read the little labels in some of the plant stores, and you're just like, this plant thrives in low light. So you're just like, great, I've got a really dark corner of my house and I can plop this plant in there and it will do fine. There's not an awful lot of plants. Actually, there's probably no plants that will thrive in very, very low light conditions as your eyes are perceiving it within your space. And I've done a much longer video in terms of what bright indirect light is and how you can measure and see the differences in terms of what your eyes perceive as bright or dark and what something like a light meter might actually perceive as bright or dark. Because a lot of the times what you need to also remember is low light conditions is something that's relevant to nature. So it might be something that does okay in nature in low light conditions, but the low light condition is under the forest canopy where there is still some dappled light coming in, and maybe it's at the very bottom, so it's still getting some light, it's just probably not getting as much light. But if you're going to put it somewhere like, and I'm going to use an extreme example, if you're going to put a plant in a cupboard somewhere and close it and it's not going to get any light, guess what? It's just going to take, even the ones that apparently thrive in low light are probably just going to be dying a slower death, essentially. Some plants that do okay with slightly lower light levels are things like a Dracaena, a Sansevieria, which I know the Sansevierias, the snake plants, have been reclassified as Dracaenas now, and the ZZ plants. Those are the only ones, truly in my experience, that do okay with that. Anecdotally, I remember either reading a story or hearing this on one of my favorite podcasts where there was an experiment that was done with the ZZ plant, the Zamioculca zamifolia plant, and they literally put it in a cupboard, dark cupboard, for a year, and a year later it didn't grow, but it was still the same, basically. It didn't die. That's also a plant that can go through quite long periods of dryness within their soil, so don't attempt it at home, basically. The one little addendum that I will make to this section is sometimes plants that you know might be better for medium or bright indirect light that might do better than you expect them to do in slightly lower light conditions is because it depends on how the growers have grown these plants. If the growers for generations of these plants have been growing them in very, very dark conditions within their growing environment, and then it comes out to the market, they might be more tolerant. It will never be thrive. They'll be more tolerant of the lower light situations, mainly because the growers also know that these are plants that people are probably going to put in very dark locations in their house. But generally speaking, if you really want to see some kind of explosive growth in some of your low light thriving plants, try giving them medium light, or try even giving them a few hours of bright indirect light and see what that does. I've seen a lot of people who have got absolutely ginormous ZZ plants that are meant to be for much lower conditions, and they have got them right in a window and they're getting bright indirect light, and these things are like a bush essentially. So bear that in mind. Then coming on to the myth of you need to let all of your houseplants fully dry out. So the growing media, usually the soil, fully dry out before you water them. This is a bit of a sticky one because yes and no. It depends on a lot of different factors, and this is why I don't like myths or tips like these that are just sweeping generalizations. Yes, some plants will do okay if you let them, and probably they prefer to do it if they let the soil go fully dry. I'm thinking, and I'm looking at the moment of my Monstera alba, or actually most of my Monstera deliciosas. Generally, actually saying that most of my Monsteras generally as a genus, at least the ones that I've experienced in my care, will prefer to go pretty much bone dry and then get watered. And they do well with this. There are a lot of other houseplants out there, common houseplants, slightly more uncommon houseplants, and quote unquote rare houseplants that are not plants that want to go fully dry. Because the issue there that you get, especially if you're just starting off, is you might be sitting there going, okay, it's fully dry. How long do I let it be fully dry? For some people, the threshold might be a day or two, and then they might just water. Some people might be, it needs to be fully dry, and I'll just forget it for another month, and it's fully dry for another month. Then you start getting issues where the roots start shrinking, potentially also maybe dying off some of the roots, and then you'll water it eventually, flood it, and those roots that are weakened at that point because it's been dry, bone dry for so long, you might then start getting root rot that's happening because the older roots are starting to rot, and that can kind of pass on to your plant, and that could cause a whole host of issues. So sweeping generalizations like you need to let your growing media go fully bone dry, I think needs to be a myth that is busted. It can work well for some plants within certain scenarios as well, and within certain parameters. So how long do you let it be fully bone dry? But for most plants, use your better judgment. Look at videos like this one online. Look at specific care videos for your specific plant. Do a quick Google search. Google is free and it takes seconds to get some clear answers from, and go from there. And I will say, even if you're Googling, get a consensus. So don't just go with the first website that you see and their suggestion. Find a couple of websites and see what the watering schedule, hate scheduling for watering, but what their suggestion is, and go for the overarching theme. Because what you might see is the first one that you see, it says, let the plant go fully bone dry before watering, but then the other 5 that you might have never have read all say, never do that and do this instead. That tells you if there's 5 people here that are saying, don't ever let it go fully bone dry, but that one person saying something different, you'd probably go with the majority on that one. This is another one that's interesting. So all Calatheas need to be evenly moist. And this might be a bit of a myth-busting situation from my own personal experience. And I do have a video on Calathea care that I'll link up the top there. But that has not been what I have found. And based on some of the comments that I'm seeing from my videos that are mentioning Calathea and kind of the watering, a lot of other people have come to the same conclusion. So as long as your Calathea soil mix is nice, chunky and airy, it can go dry. I have let a lot of my Calatheas go almost bone dry before watering them. And I think a lot of them, when I let them go more dry than keeping them evenly moist, I've had much better success. I've killed off my fair share of Calathea, some of them to rot, which is quite impressive, because I've tried to maintain that evenly moist kind of edict that you need to do this because this is what this plant desperately needs, and otherwise you'll get all these other issues. Calatheas generally will throw a whole bunch of issues at the best of times, even if you're doing everything right. But it is one of the kind of myths that I think maybe needs to be shelved, because a lot of the Calatheas and my experience, and also you need to remember with a lot of the prayer plants, they've got little bulblets in the soil that kind of look like little mini potatoes, essentially, little mini tubers. And when you see that kind of structure in plants, especially within their root system, it's because they collect moisture within those little tubers to help them survive slightly drier periods. So if it does have that there, it doesn't need to constantly be evenly moist. And it's very difficult to judge, even if you've got a moisture meter, even if you're doing all the tricks in the book to try and figure out what the moisture level is in your plant. It's very difficult to kind of keep that balance going, especially with an edict like that, because normally with most plants, you would let it go towards dry and then water, and that's how you would keep it evenly moist. But that is a very fine line to balance on. And a lot of people can get that wrong. And if you get it wrong for a few times, you might then get a Calathea that is struggling, even if you are doing everything that you've been told is right to do, which is keeping it evenly moist. The slight one that I will say there, the other plant type that people do say to do this for, which is ferns. Ferns, I find that is more true with, but also if you look at fern roots, they are very, very, very thin hair-like structures. And the leaves of the ferns are exceptionally papery thin, more so than most prayer plant leaves. Yes, don't get me wrong, prayer plant leaves can be quite thin, but if you compare something like a pinstripe Calathea leaf, which can be very thin, but then compare that thickness to the thickness of something like a maidenhair fern, they're not the same. The maidenhair fern is papery thin. So it makes sense that that would need more moisture around their roots all the time, and they can struggle if they go fully dry. But with a lot of the prayer plants, not as much of a need to keep it evenly moist all the time. And wrapping up with the last one, which is all houseplants need high levels of humidity. Again, I'm talking about the sweeping generalization myths. And you can kind of see that I'm going to go down the same rabbit hole that I did with the other one that we were talking about in terms of letting all plants, houseplants, fully dry. Yes, there's a lot of houseplants that will appreciate higher levels of humidity. A lot of the tropical houseplants, not all of them, but a lot of the tropical houseplants will appreciate higher levels of humidity. However, things like succulents, cacti, things like that are also considered houseplants. You do not want to be putting those plants in a very, very high humidity environment because they will rot out quite quickly. There's also other plants that, yes, would they appreciate high levels of humidity? Yes, 100%, because they're used to growing in kind of jungles. But at the same time, they don't need it all the time. Or, and this is the other layer of this as well, coming back to growers, especially when you're looking at some of the more common houseplants. So theoretically, and I'll use a very, very specific example here, the golden pothos is a tropical plant. So you would assume that it would really, really enjoy high levels of humidity. I can talk from experience, at least, and this might just be me. Correct me if you disagree with me down in the comments down below. But most of my pothos plants do okay in high humidity. They do equally okay in regular household humidity. And the point I'm trying to make with this is that certain plants, especially the plants that have been around for decades, and they have been grown to an alarming rate by growers, they've had a long time for these growers to get them used to more household conditions. So I'll give an example. If the golden pothos, and I keep pointing down because my golden pothos is on the floor at the moment, but if they were growing that in a high humidity level, it wouldn't have become the quintessential houseplant that everybody's seen around for as long as they have seen it around, because nobody would be able to keep it happy. Some of the more uncommon and rare plants that we're seeing now in collections, they've not had as long of a period with growers to get them used to more household conditions. Don't get me wrong, if something like the Philodendron esmeraldense was something that a lot of people wanted, and there was a big demand, and it was getting grown by nurseries all over the world for the next 20 years, would you be able to have this plant in household conditions with possibly slightly lower lights? Probably, because they would have selected the plants that did best in those conditions and propagated from that. So sweeping generalizations like every single houseplant out there needs high levels of humidity isn't entirely accurate. Some plants will, some plants won't. And to wrap this video up, anything like myths or tips or kind of guidance that's been passed down from different generations, take it with a pinch of salt. Ask the person that's giving you this advice if they've used it and they've had good success with it over a long period of time. That's the other thing. Time is a factor here. So something could work for the first month or two, but I would believe that tip a bit more if it's worked for the last 2 or 3 years, or they know from years of experience that this has worked. Yeah, I mean, in that case, go for it. It's working, and it's worked for a long, stable period of time without any detrimental effect to the plants themselves. But I'd be really curious, and hopefully some of you have made it to the end of this video, but share with me some of the myths that you've heard for plant care, some of the ones that you like, some of the ones that maybe you think a lot of people don't know and they probably should because they could work. I mean, the example of the mayonnaise thing, however odd that might be, but give me some of the things that you've heard in terms of weird houseplant care tips down below. I'm really curious to see, because I've got such a wide audience in so many different countries, and I think that also makes a difference in terms of there's different tips in maybe the Philippines that they might be in Greece or they might be in the UK. Obviously there's different conditions that these different environments are trying to fix to bring up to where that plant might need it to be. So yeah, I'd be really curious, and if I get enough interesting ones from there, I could do a follow-up video and dive into it a bit more and do some of my own research, and we can explore some of these decade-long tips that have been around for many years from different generations and see where they originated from, if they're any good, and all of these things. I think this might be an interesting one for a lot of people. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon. And I truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.